I just smiled and walked inside. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened that night changed the way I see my family forever. I have always believed that weddings are supposed to be about love, not just the kind between two young people standing at the altar, but the kind that stretches across generations. The kind that holds a family together through time, through loss, through everything life throws at you. My granddaughter, Emily, was getting married that day. She was 26, radiant, and so much like I had been at her age that it made my chest ache in a quiet, unexpected way. The ceremony was held at a beautiful vineyard just outside Napa Valley. Rolling hills, endless rows of vines, white chairs lined up perfectly under a soft California sun. It was the kind of place people dream about, and I made sure she could have it. I spent the entire morning getting ready. At 68, I don't care much about appearances anymore. But that day, I wanted to look nice. I chose a pale lavender dress, simple, elegant. The kind my late husband, Robert, used to say brought out the color in my eyes. I even wore the pearl necklace he gave me on our 40th anniversary. For a moment, standing in front of the mirror, I almost felt like he was still there. Like he would walk up behind me, rest his hands on my shoulders, and say, "You look beautiful." But of course, he didn't. He's been gone for 3 years now. And ever since then, things in the family have felt different. Subtle at first. Conversations that ended a little too quickly when I walked into the room. Invitations that somehow never quite reached me. Decisions being made without asking for my opinion, when once, I had always been included. I told myself it was just life-changing. People get busy. Families grow. That's what I told myself. Until that wedding. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emily walked down the aisle with that same bright smile she had as a little girl when she used to run into my arms after school. My son, Daniel, stood beside her, beaming with pride. And my daughter-in-law, Claire, she looked perfect. Too perfect. Her dress, her smile, the way she greeted guests, it was all carefully put together, polished, controlled, like she was hosting an event, not celebrating her own daughter's wedding. I noticed it, but I said nothing. I've learned, over the years, that silence is often the only dignity left to you. After the ceremony, everyone moved to the reception hall. It was even more stunning than the vineyard outside. Crystal chandeliers, long tables draped in ivory linen, fresh white roses arranged in perfect symmetry, soft music playing in the background. Every detail had been planned. Every detail had been paid for. By me. I made my way to the check-in table at the entrance, where guests were picking up their name cards and table assignments. A young woman stood behind the table, smiling politely as she sorted through the neatly arranged envelopes. "Last name?" she asked. "Thompson," I replied. She flipped through the stack, then handed me a small ivory card with elegant gold lettering. "Here you go, Mrs. Thompson. Table 3. I smiled, thanked her, and stepped aside. It wasn't until I looked down that everything shifted. The words were written in beautiful calligraphy. Delicate, expensive, intentional. The old lady paying for everything. For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake. My fingers tightened slightly around the card. The music, the laughter, the soft clinking of glasses around me. It all seemed to blur into something distant. Like I was standing behind a wall of glass, watching a life that no longer belonged to me. I read it again, slowly, carefully, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something else. But they didn't. They stayed exactly the same. Sharp, clear, humiliating. "Is everything all right?" the girl at the table asked, noticing I hadn't moved. I looked up at her, and I smiled. "Yes," I said softly. "Everything's perfect." I pinned the name tag to my dress, right above my heart, and then I walked into the room, as if nothing had happened. But something had, and deep down, in a place I couldn't quite name yet, I knew this wasn't a mistake. Not at all. I walked deeper into the reception hall, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Everything looked exactly the same. The chandeliers still sparkled. The music still played. People still laughed, holding glasses of champagne as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. And yet, something had shifted. Not in the room. In me. I kept my smile in place as I moved past clusters of guests, nodding politely when someone caught my eye. A few people greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Thompson, everything looks incredible. You must be so proud. This wedding is absolutely stunning." I thanked them. I said all the right things. But I noticed something else, too. The way their eyes lingered, just a second too long. The way a couple of them glanced down at my chest, at the name tag, before quickly looking away. And then, the smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. That was when I understood. They had seen it. They had read it. And they knew. I reached my table, table 3, near the center of the room. A good spot. Close enough to the stage to see everything clearly. Of course it was. I had paid for the view. I pulled out my chair and sat down slowly, smoothing my dress over my knees. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I thought they might shake. But they didn't. Instead, everything felt quiet, focused, like the moment right before a storm breaks. A woman across the table smiled at me politely. I didn't recognize her at first, but then I realized she was one of Claire's friends. "Lovely wedding," she said. "It is," I replied. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking again, briefly, to my name tag. Then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I'm sure they appreciate everything you've done." There it was. Not admiration. Not gratitude. Recognition. Of exactly what I was to them. I held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then I smiled again. "I'm sure they do," I said. But inside, a thought formed, clearer than anything I had allowed myself to think before. Do they? Or had they simply gotten used to it? The music shifted, signaling the start of the reception program. Conversations quieted as guests turned their attention toward the stage. I followed their gaze. Emily and her new husband stood in the center, glowing under the soft lights. She looked so happy, so certain of the life she was stepping into. And for a moment, just a moment, I pushed everything else aside. Because none of this was her fault. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. Then I saw Claire. She was standing off to the side, speaking with the event coordinator. Calm, confident, in control. Her eyes swept across the room briefly. And when they landed on me, they paused. Just for a second. Long enough for me to see it. Not surprise. Not concern. Satisfaction. She knew. Of course she knew. This wasn't an accident. Not a printing error. Not a careless joke. This had been planned. Carefully. Deliberately. I looked down at the name tag again. The words hadn't changed. But now, they felt heavier. Not because of what they said, but because of what they meant. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting out a slow, controlled breath. And then, I started to remember. Small things. Little moments I had brushed aside over the past few years. Claire insisting on handling the finances for family events. Daniel casually mentioning how lucky they were that I could help. The way decisions were presented to me, not as questions, but as conclusions. The way gratitude had slowly disappeared, replaced by expectation. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. It happens quietly, gradually, until one day, you look up and realize you are no longer a person in their eyes. Just a role. Just a resource. Just the one who pays for everything. A burst of laughter rose from a nearby table, pulling me back to the present. Two women were whispering to each other, trying, and failing, to be discreet. "Did you see her tag?" One of them murmured. "I know." The other replied, barely containing a smile. "That's brutal. Do you think she knows?" I didn't turn toward them. I didn't react. I simply reached for the glass of water in front of me and took a slow sip. Cool. Steady. Controlled. Of course I knew. And more importantly, I was starting to understand something else. This wasn't just about embarrassment. This was about truth. A truth they had hidden behind polite smiles and family dinners and holiday photos. A truth they had never intended for me to see so clearly. But now that I had, I couldn't unsee it. I set the glass back down carefully. Across the room, Claire laughed at something someone said, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. They looked happy, comfortable, secure, as if everything in their world was exactly as it should be. And maybe, in their minds, it was. Because for years, I had made sure of it. I had given, and given, and given, without ever asking what I was becoming in the process. But sitting there, in that beautiful room I had paid for, wearing a name tag that told the truth more honestly than anyone in that family ever had, I realized something. Something quiet. Something steady. Something that didn't need to be spoken out loud. This wasn't a mistake. And more importantly, this wasn't the beginning. This was the result of years, of choices, of silence. And now that I finally saw it clearly, the question wasn't whether I was hurt. The question was, I didn't look at them. The two women behind me kept whispering, their voices low but not low enough. They actually printed that. I heard Claire came up with the idea. A soft laugh. Not loud, but sharp. I kept my eyes forward. On the stage. On Emily. Anywhere but them. But the words had already landed. Claire came up with the idea. So that was it. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. Not even a cruel joke that went too far. This had been intentional. Designed. Approved. And displayed. I folded my hands neatly on the table, pressing my fingers together just enough to feel the tension. Grounding myself. Because something inside me was shifting again. Not breaking. Not collapsing. Just rearranging. I had spent years telling myself stories. Stories that made everything easier to accept. That Claire was just particular. That she liked control. That she didn't mean any harm. That Daniel was just busy. That families change. That I needed to adjust. I had explained away every small discomfort. Every moment that didn't feel quite right. Every time I felt out of place. But sitting there now, with that name tag pinned to my chest like a quiet declaration of who I was to them, those stories no longer worked. I glanced across the room again. Claire was still moving effortlessly between guests, greeting them, smiling, laughing at the right moments. Perfect. Always perfect. But now I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Precision. Everything she did had a purpose. The guest list. The seating. The timing. The details. Including that. Nothing about this wedding was accidental. Which meant that name tag had been exactly where it was supposed to be. Waiting for me. I let that settle. Slowly. Carefully. Because once you accept something like that, you can't go back. A man at the table next to mine leaned toward his wife, speaking quietly, but not quietly enough. She funded the whole thing, didn't she? That's what I heard. And that's how they label her. A pause. Then a small shake of the head. That's cold. I didn't turn. But I heard every word. Not sympathy. Not really. Just observation. Like I was part of the event. Something to be noticed. Discussed. Then forgotten. I reached for my napkin and adjusted it in my lap. Simple movement. Normal. Controlled. Because if I stopped to fully feel what was happening, I wasn't sure what would surface. And I wasn't going to give them that. Not here. Not now. Across the room, Daniel finally looked in my direction. Our eyes met. Just for a moment. And in that moment, I searched for something. Anything. Discomfort. Regret. Even the smallest hint that he understood what had been done. But there was nothing. He smiled. A polite, distant smile. The kind you give a guest. Not your mother. Then he looked away. And that hurt more than the name tag. Because the name tag was just words. Printed. Replaceable. But that look, that absence of recognition, that was real. That was who I had become to him. Someone present. But not important. Someone included. But not considered. I exhaled slowly. And with that breath, another layer fell away. The part of me that had still been hoping. Still waiting for someone to step in and say, this isn't right. No one did. Of course they didn't. Because for them, this was right. This was the arrangement. The understanding. The quiet agreement that had formed over the years without ever being spoken out loud. I provide. They receive. And in return, I am tolerated. I sat there, surrounded by people celebrating love, and realized I had been participating in something very different. A transaction. One that had been going on for years. Only now, for the first time, it had been made visible. Clear. Undeniable. A server approached the table, placing plates in front of each guest. Carefully prepared. Beautifully presented. Just like everything else that night. He placed mine last, offering a polite smile. Enjoy your meal, ma'am. I nodded. Thank you. My voice was steady. Calm. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. I picked up my fork, pausing just for a second before taking the first bite. And as I did, another thought settled in. Quiet. Sharp. Final. They weren't hiding it anymore. Which meant they no longer felt the need to. Because in their minds, there would be no consequences. I set my fork down gently. Across the room, Claire raised her glass, laughing again, completely at ease. Daniel stood beside her. Emily, glowing, unaware. The room moved on. The music continued. The night unfolded exactly as planned. But for me, this wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was clarity. And clarity does something very specific. It doesn't make you emotional. It makes you certain. I looked down at the name tag one more time. The old lady paying for everything. I let the words sit there. Without flinching. Without reacting. Without trying to soften them. Because now, I didn't need to. For the first time in a very long time. I wasn't confused. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't explaining things away. I understood. Completely. And once you understand something like that, you don't argue. You don't confront. You don't create a scene. You simply. I didn't eat much. I moved the food around on my plate, enough to make it look like I was participating, without actually tasting anything. Because my mind had already gone somewhere else. Back. Not to one moment, but to many. Small ones. The kind you don't notice when they happen, only when they start to connect. I remember the first time Claire asked me for help. It was years ago, shortly after she married Daniel. They had just bought their first house. A modest place. Nothing extravagant. But she had stood in my kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "We're just a little short on the down payment," she had said. Daniel stood beside her, quiet, letting her speak. "I told her we shouldn't ask," he added, but he didn't sound like he meant it. I remember smiling. Of course I did. That's what mothers do. "I'll take care of it," I said. And just like that, I did. No hesitation. No paperwork. No conditions. Because it wasn't a transaction. It was family. At least, that's what I believed. I shifted slightly in my chair, my fingers brushing against the edge of the name tag. The paper was smooth. Expensive. Chosen with care. Just like everything else that night. Another memory surfaced. A year later. Claire again. This time, it was about a renovation. "The kitchen really needs updating," she had said, flipping through design photos on her phone. Marble countertops. Custom cabinets. High-end appliances. Daniel laughed lightly. "You know how she is with details." I remember asking, "Can you afford all of that?" Claire had smiled. Not embarrassed. Not apologetic. Confident. "We'll figure it out." And somehow, we always meant me. I paid for that too. Not because they forced me. Because they didn't have to. They never asked directly. Not really. They just created the moment. The pause. The expectation hanging in the air. And I filled it. Every time. I looked across the room again. Claire was now seated at the head table, leaning in to speak to one of the bridesmaids. Her expression warm, engaged. Effortless. But now I could see the pattern behind it. The way she positioned herself. The way she let others make the final offer, without ever saying no. Another memory. This one sharper. More recent. Emily's engagement. We were all gathered in their living room. Champagne glasses. Laughter. Plans. "So we're thinking something outdoors," Claire had said, scrolling through venues. "Maybe a vineyard. Something elegant." My chest tightened slightly at the memory. Because I remember that moment clearly. The exact second everything shifted. Daniel had looked at me. Just a glance. Quick. Almost casual. But loaded. "We want it to be special," he said. Of course they did. It was their daughter's wedding. But there was something unspoken in the way he said it. Something familiar. Something I had heard before, in different words. I remember setting my glass down. "I'll help," I said. And Claire's smile. It had been immediate. Bright. Satisfied. Not surprised. Never surprised. Because by then, she already knew. I would always say yes. I let out a slow breath, bringing myself back to the present. Back to the reception. Back to the table. Back to the name tag. The old lady paying for everything. It wasn't an insult. Not entirely. It was a summary. A conclusion. The final line of a story that had been written over years. One decision at a time. One check at a time. One quiet moment where I chose to give, instead of question. I picked up my glass again, taking another small sip of water. Across the room, the speeches were beginning. Daniel stood, tapping his glass lightly. The room quieted. All eyes turned to him. He smiled. Confident. Comfortable. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "This is a very special day for our family." I listened. Carefully. Not to the words, but to what was underneath them. We couldn't have done this without the support of so many people. A pause. Just long enough. Then, and especially my mother, who made all of this possible. A few people turned toward me. Smiling. Nodding. Acknowledging. But something in his tone. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't gratitude. It was expectation fulfilled. Like he was stating a fact. Not expressing appreciation. I inclined my head slightly. Polite. Composed. Exactly what was expected of me. But inside, something settled into place. Clear. Unshakable. Because now, the past wasn't confusing anymore. It wasn't a collection of isolated moments. It was a pattern. A system. One I had participated in. One I had supported. Without ever asking what it was turning me into. And now, sitting there, watching it all unfold so perfectly, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. They hadn't changed. Not really. They had simply become more honest, more open, more comfortable showing me exactly where I stood. And I had finally caught up to that truth. I set my glass down gently. The sound was soft, almost lost in the room. But to me, it felt final. Because the question was no longer, why would they do this? That question no longer mattered. The real question was, why had I allowed it for so long? And more importantly, what was I going to allow from this moment on? I didn't react to Daniel's speech. I smiled when it was appropriate, nodded when others did, clapped when everyone else clapped. From the outside, I looked exactly like I was supposed to. Proud, composed, grateful. But inside, something had already shifted too far to go back. The applause faded, replaced by the soft hum of conversation as guests returned to their meals. I reached for my fork again, more out of habit than hunger. That's when I noticed someone standing beside my table. Mrs. Thompson. The voice was calm, familiar. I looked up. It took me a second to place him. Older now, thinner, but still carrying that same quiet professionalism. Martin, I said. He nodded slightly. Martin Reynolds. My husband's attorney. I hadn't seen him in years. Not since shortly after Robert passed. I didn't know you'd be here, I said. I was invited by Daniel, he replied. That didn't surprise me. Martin had handled most of Robert's business affairs. There were still connections, loose ends that tied people together long after someone was gone. May I sit? He asked. I gestured to the empty chair beside me. Of course. He sat down carefully, placing his hands on the table, fingers interlaced. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes moved briefly, subtly, to my name tag. And something in his expression changed. Not shock, not confusion, recognition. He understood. I see they've made things clear, he said quietly. I let out a small breath. That's one way to put it. He studied me for a moment. Not pitying, not intrusive, just observing. You're handling it well, he added. I've had practice, I replied. That earned the faintest hint of a smile. Then his expression shifted again. More serious now. Your husband anticipated something like this, he said. The words were simple, but they landed with weight. I turned slightly toward him. I'm sorry. Martin reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope. Cream-colored. Sealed. Familiar. Too familiar. I wasn't sure if I should bring this tonight, he continued. But after what I just saw, his eyes flicked once more to the name tag. I think it's time. My fingers hovered just above the table, not reaching for the envelope. Not yet. What is it? I asked. A document Robert added to his estate plan shortly before he passed. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic. Not fear. Something else. Something sharper. Why wasn't I told? I asked. Martin's voice remained steady. Because he didn't want you to act out of obligation or pressure. He wanted your family to treat you with respect because they chose to. Not because they were afraid of losing anything. I looked down at the envelope again. Still unopened. Still waiting. And if they didn't? I asked quietly. Martin held my gaze. Then this becomes relevant. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable. Just heavy. Careful. I reached for the envelope. My fingers didn't shake. That surprised me again. I broke the seal slowly, unfolding the document inside. Legal language. Structured. Precise. But the meaning was very clear. I read it once. Then again, just to be sure. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back into the envelope. I didn't react. Not outwardly. I didn't need to. Because everything I needed to understand, I already did. They don't know, I said. It wasn't a question. Martin shook his head. No, I glanced across the room. Claire was laughing again. Daniel beside her. Relaxed. Confident. Untouched. They believe everything is already settled, Martin added. Of course they did. Why wouldn't they? From their perspective, it was. I placed the envelope on the table in front of me, resting my hand lightly over it. Grounding it. Anchoring it. A quiet reminder of something that had just shifted the entire balance of the room. What do you want to do? Martin asked. I didn't answer right away. Because for the first time that night, this wasn't about reacting. It wasn't about emotion. It wasn't even about them. It was about choice. I looked around the room again. At the guests. At the decorations. At the carefully constructed image of a perfect family celebration. Then I looked down at the name tag. The old lady paying for everything. I let out a slow breath. And then, I smiled. Not the polite smile I had been wearing all evening. Not the one meant to reassure others. This one was different. Quieter. Colder. Certain. Nothing, I said. Martin raised an eyebrow slightly. Nothing. Not yet. I lifted my gaze, meeting his eyes again. They've spent years showing me exactly who they are. I continued. I think it's only fair. I let them finish. Understanding settled over his expression. A small nod. Measured. Approving. I'll be available, he said. Whenever you're ready. I inclined my head slightly. Thank you, Martin. He stood, adjusting his jacket. Then, without another word, he walked away, disappearing back into the crowd as quietly as he had appeared. I sat there for a moment longer, my hand still resting on the envelope, feeling its weight. Not heavy, just decisive. Across the room, the music picked up again. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose. The night continued exactly as planned. But now, so would I? I picked up the envelope and slipped it into my purse. Out of sight, but not forgotten. Then I straightened slightly in my chair, adjusted my name tag, and looked back toward the stage. Calm, composed, watching, because this wasn't over. Not even close. In fact, for the first time that night, I wasn't the one being watched anymore. I was the one paying attention. I didn't rush. That was the first thing that changed. For years, I had always moved quickly when it came to them. Quick to offer help. Quick to fill the silence. Quick to make things easier before anyone even had to ask. But now, I stayed still. I let the moment stretch. I let the night continue without interfering. Because for the first time, I understood something important. You learn more when you stop trying to fix things. I adjusted slightly in my chair, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. From the outside, nothing about me had changed. But inside, I was paying attention. Carefully. Deliberately. Across the room, Claire stood up again, moving from table to table with that same effortless grace. Checking on guests. Laughing at the right moments. Placing a hand lightly on someone's shoulder when she spoke. Every movement controlled. Every gesture intentional. I had seen it before. Countless times. But I had never studied it. Not like this. Not with clarity. Now, I noticed the details. The way she leaned in closer when speaking to someone important. The way her smile shifted, slightly, depending on who she was talking to. The way she positioned herself just within sight of the stage, never too far from attention. She wasn't just hosting. She was managing, curating, controlling the room. And I had funded it. I let that thought settle without reacting. Because reacting would change nothing. Understanding would. A waiter passed by, refilling glasses. I nodded my thanks, barely looking at him. My focus stayed where it needed to be. On them. On the system I had been part of for so long, without realizing it. At the head table, Daniel leaned toward Claire, saying something that made her laugh softly. Not loudly. Not in a way that drew attention. Just enough. Measured. Then she glanced out over the room again. And once more, her eyes found me. This time, I didn't look away. I held her gaze. Just for a second longer than polite. Not challenging. Not emotional. Just present. Aware. Her smile didn't falter. But something behind it shifted. A fraction. Barely noticeable. Unless you were looking for it. And now, I was. She looked away first. Returning to her conversation as if nothing had happened. But I had seen enough. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to confirm what I already suspected. This wasn't about one moment. One name tag. One careless act. This was a pattern. A structure. And people like Claire. They rely on one thing above all else. Predictability. They rely on knowing exactly how you will respond. Exactly what you will do. Exactly what you will tolerate. For years, I had been predictable. Reliable. Safe. I would smile. I would agree. I would pay. I would stay quiet. But sitting there now, that version of me no longer existed. And she didn't know that yet. I reached into my purse briefly, my fingers brushing against the envelope Martin had given me. Still there. Still waiting. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. A quiet shift in balance. A reminder that for the first time in a long time, I had something they didn't expect. Information. Time. Control. I withdrew my hand and placed it back on the table. Across from me, the woman who had spoken earlier glanced at me again. Her expression softer now. More careful. Are you enjoying the evening? She asked. I met her eyes. And smiled. I am, I said. And in a way, that was true. Not because the evening was pleasant, but because it was honest. For the first time, Everything was exactly what it appeared to be. No illusions. No misunderstandings. Just truth. Clear and undeniable. The music shifted again, signaling the first dance. Emily and her husband stepped onto the floor, the lights dimming slightly as all attention turned toward them. The room softened. The mood changed. And for a moment, everything felt almost normal. I watched her as she moved across the floor. Light. Happy. Unaware. And again, that small part of me, the one that still held on to something gentler, wanted to protect that. To separate her from the rest of it. To believe she didn't know. Maybe she didn't. Or maybe she had simply learned her place in the same system. The music continued. Applause followed. And just like that, the moment passed. The lights brightened again. Conversations resumed. The night moved forward. But I didn't. Not in the same way. Because now, I wasn't just part of the evening anymore. I was studying it, mapping it, understanding where everything fit. And more importantly, where I fit. I glanced down once more at the name tag. The words hadn't changed. But they didn't sting anymore. Not the same way. Because now, they weren't defining me. They were exposing them. I reached up and adjusted it slightly, making sure it sat straight against my dress. Perfectly visible. Exactly where they wanted it. And I let it stay there. Because sometimes, the best way to understand something is to let it reveal itself completely. Without interruption. Without resistance. Without warning. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze steady, my breathing even. Waiting. Watching. Because they still thought this was their night. Their moment. Their story. And I was just a supporting role. But they didn't realize. The story had already changed. They just hadn't reached that part yet. By the time dessert was served, I had stopped pretending to relax. Not outwardly. Outwardly, I was exactly the same. Calm. Polite. Composed. But inside, everything had sharpened. Every word. Every glance. Every small interaction that most people would ignore. I noticed. The cake was beautiful. 3 tiers. White frosting, delicate sugar flowers, a design that looked effortless but cost more than most people would admit. I knew exactly how much it cost. Because I had paid for it. A server placed a slice in front of me. Enjoy, he said. I nodded. Thank you. I didn't touch it. Across the room, I could hear another conversation forming. This time, closer. Clearer. 2 men standing near the bar. Yeah, I heard she covered the whole thing. Must be nice. A pause. Then, well, when you've got someone like that, why wouldn't you? A quiet laugh. Not cruel. Not loud. Just casual. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the words. The tone. There was no shock in it. No discomfort. No sense that something was wrong. Just acceptance. As if this arrangement was normal. Expected. I shifted slightly in my chair, letting my gaze drift across the room again. And that's when I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Near the far table, a small group had gathered around Claire. Leaning in. Listening. Interested. She was speaking softly, but I could see the rhythm of it. The way she told stories. The way she held attention. And then, she gestured, lightly, in my direction. Not obvious. Not dramatic. Just a small movement of her hand. But it was enough. The group followed her gesture. Their eyes turned toward me. And even from across the room, I could feel it. That shift. That quiet, collective understanding. They knew exactly who I was. Not by name. Not by relationship. But by function. I held my posture. Didn't move. Didn't react. Because reacting would only confirm what they already believed. Instead, I let them look. I let them see. I let them draw their conclusions. And then, I watched what happened next. Claire smiled again. Said something else. And the group laughed. Not loudly. But enough. Enough to tell me. This wasn't new. This wasn't something she had just revealed tonight. This was a story she had been telling. Repeatedly. Consistently. Carefully. And I had never heard it before. Because I had never been in the room when it was told. A strange kind of clarity settled over me. Not painful. Not anymore. Just precise. I reached for my water again, taking another slow sip. Across the table, the woman from earlier hesitated before speaking. I hope you don't mind me saying this, she began carefully. I looked at her. Go ahead. She glanced briefly at my name tag, then back at me. You deserve more respect than this. Simple words. Quiet. But sincere. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I nodded. Thank you, I said. And I meant it. Not because I needed her validation, but because it confirmed something. Something important. This wasn't invisible. People saw it. They just weren't involved. And that's the difference. People can see something is wrong and still choose not to interfere. I didn't blame them. Why would they? This wasn't their family. This wasn't their place. For years, it hadn't even been mine. Not really. I looked down again at the name tag, at the words that had started all of this. And for the first time, I saw it differently. Not as an insult, not as a wound, but as evidence. Clear, undeniable, public. They hadn't just treated me this way. They had labeled me, defined me, displayed me. And once something is displayed like that, it can't be taken back. The music softened again, and I heard someone tapping a glass. Another speech. This time, it was Claire. Of course it was. She stood gracefully, adjusting her dress, waiting just long enough for the room to quiet completely. Control. Always control. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began, her voice smooth, practiced. This day means so much to our family. I listened, not to the words, but to the structure, the way she built her sentences, the way she positioned people, acknowledged them, included them. And then, there it was. Again. And of course, we couldn't have done any of this without generous support. A pause. A soft smile. Her eyes flicked toward me. Brief. Calculated. Then back to the room. Some people prefer to stay behind the scenes, she continued lightly. But we all know how important they are. Laughter. Soft. Polite. Controlled. And just like that, she had done it again. Without saying my name. Without needing to. Because she didn't have to. Everyone already knew. I sat there, completely still. My hands resting lightly on the table. My breathing steady. Because now, there was no doubt left. No confusion. No room for interpretation. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't careless. This was deliberate. Repeated. Reinforced. Over time. And tonight, it had simply been made visible. I leaned back slightly, my gaze steady on Claire as she finished her speech, accepting applause like she had earned it. Like this was her moment. And maybe, in her mind, it was. Because for years, I had made it possible. But sitting there now, with everything laid out so clearly in front of me, I realized something else. Something just as important. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had stopped seeing me entirely. And when someone stops seeing you, they stop expecting anything from you. No resistance. No change. No consequences. I let that thought settle. Because that was where the real shift happened. Not in anger. Not in confrontation. But in understanding. They thought I would stay the same. That I would smile. That I would accept it. That I would continue. Exactly as before. I glanced once more at the room. At the people. At the carefully constructed illusion of a perfect family celebration. And then I looked back at Claire. Still smiling. Still confident. Still certain. And for the first time that night, I felt something different. Not hurt. Not even disappointment. Just certainty. Because now I knew exactly what I had. And more importantly, exactly what they didn't see coming. By the time the music picked up again, the room had settled into something comfortable. Predictable. People were laughing louder now. The formalities were over. The structure of the evening had loosened, and with it, so had their awareness. That's when people show themselves most clearly. Not when they're being watched, but when they believe they're not. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting that shift happen around me. Observing. Waiting. Then, slowly I stood. No sudden movement. No need to draw attention. Just a quiet decision, carried out naturally. I smoothed my dress, adjusted the small clasp of my purse, and stepped away from the table. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. Of course they didn't. To them, I wasn't central to anything happening in that room. I was background. Expected. Unquestioned. And that made everything easier. I moved along the edge of the reception hall, past groups of guests who barely noticed me. Their conversations continued uninterrupted. Laughter. Glasses clinking. Fragments of sentences drifting through the air. Beautiful venue. So generous. Must have cost a fortune. I didn't slow down. I didn't need to. Because I already knew what they were talking about. And who they were talking about. I reached the quieter side of the hall, near the large windows that overlooked the vineyard. The night had settled outside. Dark. Still. Peaceful. A sharp contrast to the noise behind me. For a moment, I just stood there, looking out, letting the silence settle around me. Not to escape, but to think. Clearly. Without interruption. I reached into my purse again. This time, I took the envelope out. Carefully. Deliberately. I opened it once more, scanning the document again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to feel it, the weight of it, the certainty of it, every line, every condition, every consequence. It hadn't changed. Of course it hadn't. But something in me had. I folded it again, slower this time, more intentional, then slipped it back into my purse. Not hidden, not forgotten, just placed exactly where I needed it to be. Behind me, the music swelled as another dance began. Applause followed. The night moved forward. Unaware, I turned slightly, leaning against the edge of the window frame, letting my gaze return to the room. And I watched them. Not emotionally, not personally, objectively. Claire had returned to the center of the room. Of course she had. That's where she belonged, where she placed herself, where she controlled the flow of attention. Daniel stood near her again, speaking to a group of guests, his posture relaxed, confident, comfortable. They looked secure, like nothing could disrupt what they had built. And why would they think otherwise? For years, nothing had. I let my eyes move across the room more slowly this time, mapping it, where people stood, who spoke to whom, who influenced the energy, who followed it. And slowly, a structure revealed itself. Not obvious, but clear. There were people who led, people who followed, and people who stayed invisible. I had spent years in that last category, by choice, by habit, by misunderstanding what that role actually meant. But tonight, I wasn't invisible anymore, not to myself. And that changed everything. I straightened slightly, pushing away from the window, not because I was ready to act, but because I was ready to decide. There's a difference. Acting is reactive. Deciding, that's control. I walked back toward the room at the same measured pace. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just steady, as if I had simply stepped away for air. Which, in a way, I had. But I returned with something different. Not anger, not confrontation, just clarity. As I re-entered the main space, a server passed by with a tray of champagne. I paused, considered, then took a glass. "Thank you," I said. He nodded and continued on. I held the glass lightly, not drinking from it yet, just holding it, blending back into the room. Seamlessly. No one questioned it. No one noticed the shift. And that was exactly what I needed. Because what comes next only works when people believe nothing has changed. I moved closer to the center now. Not directly toward them. Not yet. But closer. Within range. Within view. Claire glanced in my direction again. A quick check. A habit. And this time, I gave her exactly what she expected. A small smile. Polite. Unthreatening. Familiar. Her expression relaxed immediately. Just slightly. But enough. She turned back to her conversation without a second thought. And in that moment, I knew. She still believed she understood me. Still believed she knew exactly how I would behave. Exactly what I would accept. Exactly where I stood. And that was her mistake. I lifted the glass slightly, as if acknowledging someone across the room. Maintaining the illusion. Keeping everything exactly as it had been. On the surface. But underneath, everything had already shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't processing. I wasn't questioning. I had moved past all of that. Now, I was preparing. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Precisely. Because timing matters. More than anything else. And the best moments. The ones that truly change everything. They don't happen when emotions are high. They happen when everything feels stable. Safe. Certain. I took a small sip of champagne. Cool. Controlled. And let my gaze settle once more on the room. On Claire. On Daniel. On the carefully constructed version of reality they had built. And I made a decision. Not spoken. Not visible. But absolute. I would let this night continue. Exactly as they intended. I would let them feel comfortable. Confident. Untouched. I would let them believe that nothing had changed. Because when people believe that, they stop being careful. They stop hiding. They show everything. And when they do, that's when you see them clearly. I set the glass down on a nearby table. Untouched now. Unnecessary. And I took my seat again. Calm. Composed. Watching. Because the night wasn't over. Not even close. And neither was I. The night had reached that point where everything felt settled. Not quieter. Not calmer. Just certain. People had eaten. Drinks had been poured. Speeches had been made. The structure of the evening was complete. What remained now was comfort. And comfort makes people careless. I sat at my table, hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged. If anyone looked at me, they would see exactly what they expected. A grandmother, a guest, a woman quietly enjoying the evening. Nothing more. That was the role they had assigned me. And for now, I let them keep it. Across the room, the energy had shifted toward the dance floor. Groups had formed. Circles of conversation. Clusters of laughter. And at the center of it all, Claire. Of course. She wasn't dancing. Not yet. She was managing the room again. Moving between groups. Checking reactions. Maintaining control. I watched her for a moment. Not with emotion. Just with attention. Because once you understand someone's pattern, you don't need to guess what they'll do next. You just wait. Near the bar, Daniel was speaking with two men I recognized faintly from his business circle. Their body language was relaxed. Open. Confident. The kind of conversation that comes easily when you feel secure. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but I didn't need to. Fragments were enough. Big event. Must have taken a lot to pull this off. Daniel laughed lightly. Yeah, well, we had help. One of the men nodded. I heard. A pause. Then, must be nice having someone take care of things like that. Another small laugh. Daniel didn't correct him. He didn't clarify. He didn't shift the tone. He just accepted it. Like it was normal. Like it was understood. And in that moment, something finalized inside me. Not anger. Not hurt. Just confirmation. This wasn't just Claire. This wasn't just manipulation. This was agreement. Participation. Daniel wasn't unaware. He wasn't caught in the middle. He had chosen his place in this. And I had allowed it. For years. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my gaze move across the room again. And that's when I noticed something else. Subtle, but important. The way people looked at me now. Not directly. Not openly. But in passing. Quick glances. Short pauses. Whispers that stopped when I moved too close. The atmosphere around me had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to tell me that what had been implied earlier was now understood. The name tag had done its job. It had defined me. Publicly. Clearly. And now, everyone was adjusting to that definition. I remained still, letting it happen. Because this part mattered. This was where perception settled. Where impressions became beliefs. And beliefs, they're difficult to change. Which meant, I didn't need to change them. I just needed to let them complete. A burst of laughter rose from behind me again. This time, I recognized the voice. Claire. I turned slightly, just enough to see her without drawing attention. She was speaking to a small group now, her posture relaxed, her expression bright. I told her we didn't need anything extravagant, she was saying lightly. But you know how these things go. Soft laughter. Someone replied. Well, it turned out amazing. Claire smiled. Yes, it did. Another pause. Then, we're very lucky to have support. Again, that word. Support. Carefully chosen. Soft enough to sound gracious. Vague enough to avoid specifics. But clear enough for those who understood. I watched the group's reaction. Nods. Smiles. Understanding. No one questioned it. No one pushed further. Because they didn't need to. The narrative was already in place. And she had told it well. I turned back toward the table slowly. My movements measured. Controlled. Because now, there was nothing left to uncover. Nothing left to confirm. Everything I needed had already been shown. Not hidden. Not concealed. Just presented. Piece by piece. Until the picture was complete. I reached up briefly, touching the edge of the name tag again. Still there. Still visible. Exactly where they wanted it. I let my hand fall back to my lap. And for a moment, I did nothing. No movement. No thought. Just stillness. Because this was the moment before change. The moment where everything could still continue exactly as it had. Where I could choose to ignore it. To accept it. To return to the role they had created for me. It would be easy. Familiar. Expected. But sitting there, surrounded by people who had already decided who I was, I realized something else. Something quiet. But absolute. If I stayed in that role, it would never change. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Not ever. Because why would it? It worked. For them. I exhaled slowly. And with that breath, the last hesitation disappeared. Not replaced by anger. Not replaced by urgency. Just replaced by decision. Across the room, Claire lifted her glass again, toasting with another group. Daniel beside her. Emily dancing now. Her laughter light, untouched by anything happening beneath the surface. The night continued. Beautiful. Perfect. Exactly as planned. And that was the moment I understood something clearly. They believed this was the end of the story. The celebration. The result. The moment, everything came together. But for me, this wasn't the end. This was the setup, the final confirmation, the point where everything aligned exactly as it needed to. I straightened slightly in my chair. Not noticeably, just enough. Because now, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was ready, not to react, not to confront, but to shift the balance. Quietly, precisely, at the right moment. And that moment was coming. The moment came quietly, not announced, not dramatic, just available. Claire had just finished another round of conversation when the music softened again. Someone tapped a glass. A signal. Another speech. Of course. There's always one more. The room gradually settled, conversations fading into a low hum before disappearing entirely. All eyes shifted toward the center. And this time, I stood. Not quickly, not abruptly, just deliberately. The movement itself was enough. Subtle, but noticeable. A few people turned. Then more. Because I wasn't supposed to stand. Not like that. Not at this point in the evening. Not without being invited. I smoothed my dress once. Adjusted my posture. And then I stepped forward. Each step measured. Even. Unhurried. The sound of my heels against the floor seemed louder now, though nothing else had changed. Or maybe, it was just that people were finally paying attention. I didn't look at Claire. Not yet. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't look at anyone. Until I reached the center. Then, I turned. And faced the room. There was a pause. Small. But heavy. The kind of pause people don't know how to fill. A few polite smiles. A few uncertain glances. Someone shifted in their seat. Waiting. Trying to understand what this was. I gave them a smile. Calm. Composed. Familiar. I won't take much of your time, I said. My voice carried easily. Clear. Steady. Not loud. But enough. I just wanted to say a few words. That was all it took. The room settled completely now. Attention focused. Curiosity engaged. Because this wasn't part of the program. And people remember what doesn't belong. I glanced briefly toward Emily. She looked surprised. Confused. But not uncomfortable. Not yet. Good. That mattered. Then my eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, to Claire. Just for a second. Long enough. Her smile was still there. But it had tightened. Just slightly. And then, to Daniel. He looked uncertain now. That was new. I turned back to the room. And continued. This is a beautiful evening, I said. Truly. A few nods. Soft agreement. It's everything a wedding should be. I paused. Let that sit. Then, and more. Another small pause. Controlled. Measured. I let my hand move lightly to my chest. Resting just above the name tag. Not pointing. Not highlighting. Just acknowledging. I've been introduced in many ways tonight, I said. A ripple. Barely noticeable. But it moved through the room. People understood. Of course they did. I think this might be the most honest one. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. Claire didn't move. But her eyes. They were fixed on me now. Careful. Focused. Calculating. I kept my tone exactly the same. No change. No escalation. Just steady. For years, I continued. I believed I was helping my family. Simple. Direct. No emotion attached. I believe that when you give, it strengthens the people you love. A few nods again. Reflexive. Because that's what people expect. That it builds something lasting. I let the silence stretch just a little longer this time. Then, but tonight, I lowered my hand slowly. I realized something else. The room was still now. Completely. No movement. No distraction. Because now, they were listening. Not casually. Not politely. Carefully. Giving without being seen, I said, doesn't build love. A pause. It builds expectation. No one moved. And expectation, I let the word sit, turns people into roles. My gaze moved across the room. Slowly. Not searching. Not accusing. Just acknowledging. Tonight, I was given a role. I glanced down briefly at the name tag. Then back up. And for the first time, a breath. Controlled. I accepted it. That was the shift. Subtle. But real. Because now, they didn't know where this was going. Claire's expression had changed. Not visibly. But internally. You could feel it. Daniel had straightened slightly. Emily looked between us now, uncertain. And the room was no longer comfortable. I reached into my purse. Slowly. No sudden movements. No drama. Just intention. And I took out the envelope. Held it lightly in my hand. Visible. But unexplained. This, I said, was something my husband prepared before he passed. That got their attention. Completely. Because now, this wasn't just emotional. It was real. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I didn't know about it until tonight. I continued. Truth. Simple. Clear. But it seems, a small pause. He understood something I didn't. I looked directly at Claire now. Not long. Not aggressively. Just enough. Then back to the room. That respect isn't something you assume. Another pause. It's something you show. Silence. Heavy now. Full. And then, I smiled. The same calm smile. The same composed expression. As if nothing had changed. I won't interrupt the evening any further, I said. And I meant it. Because this wasn't about creating a scene. This was about changing the balance. Quietly. Irreversibly. I placed the envelope back into my purse. Slowly. Deliberately. Then I inclined my head slightly. Enjoy the rest of the night. And without waiting for a reaction, I stepped back, turning away from the center, walking calmly, back toward my table. Behind me, no one spoke. Not immediately, because now, they understood. Something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And this time, it wasn't me who had been defined. It was them. I didn't rush back to my seat. I walked at the same steady pace as before. Unhurried. Composed. As if nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. But the room was no longer the same. You could feel it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just differently. The music didn't start again right away. The conversations didn't resume as easily. There was a pause. A hesitation. Like something invisible had moved through the room and left everything slightly out of place. I reached my chair and sat down. Smoothed my dress. Placed my hands gently on the table. And waited. Because this part was never about what I said. It was about what they would do next. Across the room, Claire was still standing. But not the same way. Her posture was still perfect. Her expression still controlled. But the ease was gone. She leaned slightly toward Daniel, speaking to him in a lower voice now. Not for the room. Just for him. Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked at me. Then back at her. Then at the floor. Uncertain. That was new. I had never seen that in him before. Not when it came to me. Not when it came to anything involving me. Because until now, there had never been anything to question. Everything had been simple. Predictable. Given. But now, there was something to process. Something that didn't fit the version of reality they had built. And that takes time. The guests felt it too. Even if they didn't fully understand it. A few conversations restarted. Quietly. Carefully. Different now. Less certain. Less relaxed. The kind of conversations people have when they're trying to make sense of something they weren't prepared to witness. At the table next to mine, one of the men leaned in toward his companion. That wasn't planned, was it? He whispered. The other shook his head slowly. No, a pause. Then, that didn't sound like a joke. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. Because the shift had already happened. Not because I had raised my voice. Not because I had accused anyone. But because I had changed the narrative. And once a narrative changes, everything else has to adjust around it. Across the room, Claire straightened. Recomposed. That part of her hadn't changed. It wouldn't. People like her don't fall apart in public. They adapt. Quickly, she stepped forward again, lifting her glass slightly. All right, she said lightly, her voice carrying just enough. Let's not lose the mood tonight. A small laugh followed. Encouraged. Controlled. She was trying to reset the room. To bring things back to where they had been. To close what had just been opened. And for a moment, it worked. A few people smiled. A few more lifted their glasses. The music started again, softer at first. Then louder. Familiar. Comforting. The structure returning. But something underneath it didn't. Because once people have seen something, they don't forget it. They may ignore it. They may move past it. But they remember. And now, they had something to remember. Daniel stepped forward beside Claire, his hand briefly touching her arm. A signal. Stability. Partnership. He said something quietly to her. She nodded. Smiled again. But this time, there was effort in it. Subtle. But visible. I watched it all without reacting. Because this wasn't my moment anymore. It was theirs. Their response. Their adjustment. Their attempt to hold everything together. And in that, you learn more than you ever could from confrontation. I reached for my water again, taking a slow sip. The glass was cool. Steady. Grounding. Across the room, a few guests glanced toward me again. Not openly. But enough. Curiosity. Recognition. A shift in perception. I wasn't just part of the background anymore. Not to them. Not after that. And that mattered. More than anything I could have said. Because respect doesn't come from words. It comes from position. From presence. From what people understand you are capable of. And now, they were beginning to understand. I set the glass down carefully. The sound was soft. Almost lost in the music. But to me, it marked something. Final. Not the end. But the turning point. Claire was speaking again, guiding the evening forward. Another dance. Another moment. Another attempt to return everything to normal. And maybe, for most people in that room, it would. They would finish their meals. Enjoy the music. Leave with polite smiles and pleasant memories. Because that's what people do. They take what they're given and move on. But for Claire, for Daniel, for the people who actually understood what had just happened, nothing was normal anymore. Not really. Because now, there was something waiting. Unspoken. Unresolved. I reached into my purse again, my fingers brushing lightly against the envelope. Still there. Still quiet. Still powerful. I didn't take it out. Not yet. Because this wasn't about proving anything. Not tonight. That would come later. When it mattered more. When it couldn't be ignored. When it would land exactly where it needed to. I withdrew my hand and placed it back on the table. Calm. Patient. Certain. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting to what they were doing. I was allowing it. And that changes everything. Across the room, Claire laughed again. Daniel beside her. Emily dancing. The night continuing. As if it could still be what it was meant to be. But beneath that, there was something else now. Something quieter. Heavier. A shift that couldn't be undone. And they felt it. Even if they didn't say it. Even if they didn't fully understand it yet. They felt it. Because control, once it slips, even slightly, it never returns the same way again. And that night, without raising my voice, without making a scene, without saying anything more than necessary, I had taken it back. I didn't stay until the end. I didn't need to. The music grew louder as the night went on. The dance floor filled. Laughter returned. Lighter now, more deliberate, as if people were choosing it instead of feeling it. From a distance, everything looked the same again. A wedding. A celebration. A family gathered under soft lights and expensive decorations. Exactly as it was meant to be. But I knew better. Because once you see something clearly, you don't unsee it. I stood quietly from my table. No announcement. No farewell. No need. I picked up my purse, smoothing my hand over the fabric of my dress one last time. A small, familiar gesture. The kind I had done hundreds of times before. But this time, it meant something different. I reached up, and slowly, I removed the name tag. The old lady paying for everything. I looked at it for a moment. Not with anger. Not with pain. Just recognition. Because those words, they had told the truth. Not about who I was, but about who they believed I was. And that difference, that was everything. I placed the name tag gently on the table. Face up. Exactly where it could be seen. Then I turned and walked away. No one stopped me. Of course they didn't. The music was loud. The room was full. And I had spent years teaching them not to notice when I left. But that didn't matter anymore. Because this time, I wasn't leaving quietly. I was leaving completely. I stepped out of the reception hall and into the night. The air was cooler outside. Still. Calm. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything from you. I paused for a moment at the edge of the vineyard, looking out over the rows of vines stretching into the dark. Robert would have liked this place. That thought came easily. Without effort. Without pain. Just there. I could almost hear his voice again. Not clearly. Not like before. But enough. Enough to remember who I had been. Before I started becoming something else for other people. I reached into my purse and took out the envelope one last time. Held it in my hands. Felt its weight. Not heavy. Just certain. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. Because its purpose had already been fulfilled. Not as a weapon. Not as revenge. But as clarity. Robert hadn't left me control. He had left me a choice. And for the first time in years, I understood how to use it. I slipped the envelope back into my purse. And exhaled slowly. Behind me, the music continued. Faint now. Distant. Like something I was already moving away from. Because I was. Not just from the building. Not just from the night. But from the role I had been living in for far too long. I walked toward the parking area at the edge of the property. Each step steady. Unhurried. Certain. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Because there was nothing left to question. Not anymore. Tomorrow, things would begin to change. Not loudly, not publicly, but definitively. Calls would be made. Decisions would be documented. Structures would shift. And for the first time, those changes would not be made for them. They would be made for me. But tonight was enough. I reached my car and paused for just a moment before opening the door. Not to look back. I didn't need to, because everything behind me was already clear. I had seen it, understood it, accepted it. And once you do that, there's nothing left to return to. I opened the door and got inside, closing it softly behind me. The silence settled immediately, complete, undisturbed. I placed my purse on the passenger seat. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel. Still, calm. Then, after a moment, I smiled. Not out of relief, not out of victory, but out of something quieter, something steadier, something that didn't depend on anyone else. For years, I had been defined by what I gave, measured by what I provided, reduced to a role I never questioned. But that night, in a room full of people who thought they understood me, I finally understood myself. I wasn't their support. I wasn't their solution. I wasn't their silent resource. And I never had been. I started the engine. The soft hum filled the car. Grounding. Real. And as I pulled away from the vineyard, leaving the lights behind me, I didn't feel like I had lost anything. Because I hadn't. I had simply stopped giving it away.